The president's got a big press conference tomorrow scheduled, but we should talk about some things first.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
All right, there's a classic mistake. The president-elect has a press conference tomorrow, not the president, but the way things have been going and the way the media coverage has been for Donald Trump, you'd think that he already was the president. I don't remember in my lifetime this kind of president-elect kind of coverage. And to be honest with you, like him or not, agree with him or not, President Barack Obama has been pretty sportsmanlike about this thing all the way through. This past weekend did an interview on ABC's George Stephanopoulos program where he, I think, again, made some diplomatic points about the way Donald Trump is comporting himself, but we'll get some thoughts from our guest on that. Professor Marc Genest from the Naval War College is back to talk to us about these very important things like Russian hacking stories and the like, and I'm sure tomorrow that will dominate the press conference. Now, disclosure, in case something is broken because of scheduling issues with Dan York State of Mind, this program that you're seeing now on Tuesday night was recorded yesterday afternoon. That doesn't happen a lot during the early portions of our week, but we had some things that we had to take care of. So I hope that we haven't had some reschedule of that press conference, but I knew this, the conversation with Professor Genest needed to get done before the press conference because everything we talk about here could get blown up on Wednesday and we'll have to circle him back. Thankfully, he's always available to speak to us with his thoughts, not for the Naval War College, but for himself. First, let's give you an update. Here's the latest that we had Monday afternoon, meaning as I'm taping this broadcast, on both the appointments and the post-game from the Russian hacking hearings last week.
Senator Mitch McConnell showed up at Trump Tower for meetings Monday morning ahead of Senate confirmation hearings for President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet choices.
We just simply talked about the Senate agenda and how we're ready to get going once he gets down there.
The first set of hearings begins on Capitol Hill tomorrow with Senator Jeff Sessions, who is up for Attorney General, and General John Kelly, who is nominated for Secretary of Homeland Security. That's followed by another 5 hearings Wednesday and 4 more on Thursday. The head of the government's ethics office wrote a letter to Democratic leaders saying the agency still hasn't completed its reviews of the nominees. He wrote the pace has left some of the nominees with potentially unknown or unresolved ethics issues shortly before their scheduled hearings.
Everybody will be properly vetted, as they have been in the past, and I'm hopeful that we'll get up to 6 or 7, particularly the national security team, in place on day one.
Meanwhile, Trump administration officials are now conceding U.S. intelligence agency reports are correct. Russia was behind the election hacking of Democratic emails. But Trump's incoming chief of staff, Reince Priebus, says the U.S. sanctions against Russia were politics.
That is clearly politically motivated to discredit the victory of President-elect Trump.
Monday morning, Russia said the hacking claims are nothing but a witch hunt. And the Kremlin says it will work with the Trump administration after the inauguration to set up a meeting with the two leaders.
It's a really complicated story, isn't it?
Very complicated. It's odd to see Republicans supporting Putin, and not supporting them, but at least being easy on Putin.
Well, I guess there's a Trumpian Republican flavor to Putin. You've got some old guard. You got a senator from South Carolina, a senator from Arizona, who are thinking that Putin is going to be more or less dealt with in a much more aggressive fashion and demanding so, and actually wondering out loud if Donald Trump didn't get how he was briefed last week, whether he's actually capable of doing the job. So it's hard for people to actually follow traditional party politics in this whole saga, isn't it?
Trump is a disruptive force. The next 4 years are going to be something that we've never experienced before. It's going to be fascinating, potentially dangerous, potentially constructive if he can cross party lines.
Well, let's pick that apart as we go. What's going to be dangerous and what's going to be constructive. By the way, Happy New Year and thanks for coming back. Just for people to be able to follow this story, though, it is difficult in the sense that Reince Priebus still acting not chief of staff-ish, I think, but campaign-ish with that kind of talk. This notion that Barack Obama dispersing some 35 Russians out of the country was a political thing. In a way, I can't argue that because Barack Obama has been weak in response to hacking issues in general, and so while everything is political, this has a little bit more political flavor. But what's interesting is that there are Republican conservative types, like the senators I'm talking about, who think it was not enough. And Priebus is sitting here still arguing about the legitimacy of the election. It's right. Donald Trump won't do this, it seems. Well, you're the guest. Let me not make a speech. It's hard for people for everybody to try to work this thing out.
Let's simplify it.
Please.
Trump is most concerned that the Democrats are trying to delegitimize his victory. That's the only thing he's concerned with.
He can't let it go.
He can't, because he understands that his power is at its height in the first 100 days or so. If he comes into his new administration with a cloud hanging over his head, then he feels it will diminish his ability to influence.
But the cloud
There's a legitimate
exists.
point to that.
Can't he distinguish between what most have said, and that is there is no evidence, and the reports indicate that there's no evidence that any voting booths were damaged, that the actual execution of the election was not infiltrated, that the numbers are real. And so if the numbers are real, the election is legitimate. The politics of the election were affected by the Russian behavior, and that's still a decision that voters have got to make and sift through. Why can't he say, look, hacking of our political process is problematic. We need to get and figure out what it is. Notwithstanding, I'm legit.
We forget that while Trump has been incredibly successful beyond anyone's wildest dreams, he is a political novice. And he hasn't
The
yet
people around
learned.
him aren't.
Well, yes, but he hasn't. Remember, this is an ego-driven person, as any presidential candidate would be, but him more so. He hasn't yet arrived at the conclusion that it is sometimes better for you to take the hit and move on and change the subject and go on to other things rather than fight the old fights. And he still hasn't been able to, he's not politically mature enough to let that go. And I think that's going to damage him the more he stays with this and the less time he spends building a new agenda.
Are the people around him not able to explain this to him? I mean, listen, this is not the first time I've asked you that question all the way through the campaign. Like, you know, when I watch, you know, Kellyanne Conway make her presentations or Priebus make his presentations, I know they know that they're full of it. I know they're going to write a book in 8 years talking about what they had to do for the president-elect and then the president in the time that they had to do it. I know that they're full of it, and they know that we're, right?
Yes, but how do you stop Donald Trump from tweeting, particularly at night? I mean, he's alone. They're not hovering around him.
Right.
So this is a person who doesn't have the kind of discipline that others might have. Plus, with that new technology, and remember, he won the presidency through his tweeting, through his aggressive rhetoric. So it's hard to tell someone who's achieved as much as he has to stop doing what allowed him victory.
Yeah, but I'm not even, the tweeting behavior I've given up on. I don't see it changing. Do you?
I would hope it would.
I don't see it changing. It would be a bonus if it did, but I'm now trying to get conditioned just as a citizen, because that's all I am here anyway, is a citizen like you. Just I'm going to accept that he's going to use that platform. What I'm asking is, why can't they get him to tweet or make speeches or hopefully respond in a press conference tomorrow, and maybe he will, doubt it, that he acquiesces to the idea that the Russians had an impact on the dialogue of the election, but not the results. And that any impact on the dialogue of an election by a foreign power like Russia has to be dealt with, has to be vetted, has to be investigated, and has to have some reconciliation. That's what I think America wants, even those who voted for Trump.
I would agree. The problem is, and you see this at New York Times and some media coverage, where while they say the voting machines haven't been tampered with, there are a lot of innuendos saying with a few 100,000 votes, who knows how this would have turned had not the WikiLeaks exposed the DNC emails. So there is that undercurrent of what Trump would call the liberal media that is always going to try to delegitimize his victory in his eyes.
Well, I think the way you diffuse it is just by acquiescing to the facts and then moving on, because it's yesterday's argument. Oh well, Hillary Clinton cooked her own goose on X number of levels. Joe Biden's out there talking about how Hillary Clinton didn't do enough to understand, the $90,000 a year middle American working, stiffs of America, like so many of us. Barack Obama's already weighed in and suggested that they missed a couple of concepts. When it all pans out, no one's going to worry about it anymore.
Only you can make me defend Trump because I'm not usually in that position. I understand that, and I think this is a man with such an ego and is incapable of allowing an aggressive shot at him to go by. Now, hopefully, as he matures
Even
in the
Meryl
presidency,
Streep, for crying out loud, right?
Right. That was a little over the top, but
Who? She
Meryl Streep.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
I can't
But it's
figure
Hollywood.
I can't figure out who's worse. Meryl Streep, who just uses a platform like she owns it, and Donald Trump, who can't, just go to bed and say, "Oh, Meryl," right?
But remember, the secret of his success is the vicious counterpunch, and he can't let that go because that is the reason why he succeeded the way he has.
In everything he does.
In everything he does, and apparently that's the way it was in the business community.
All right. So when we come back, we'll talk about, the asset and the liability, the worry and not so much. But first, let me just remind you that the folks at Navigant Credit Union, honoring your New Year's resolutions and the like. Oh, there I am. I'm like looking at my side for a while. They are offering a whole brand new array of mobile banking features to help you get your banking and other things done. With Navigant's mobile banking app, excuse me for looking at my notes here, you can pay your bills, deposit checks, transfer money, set limits on your spending. You can use Apple or Samsung Pay in stores, or even send and receive cash through texts. Learn all about it at navigantcu.org. Remember, they're federally insured by the NCUA. Be right back.
There is still much we do not know, but Russia's involvement in these intrusions does not appear to be in any doubt.
True?
Oh, true. Absolutely true.
Okay.
I accept the intelligence community's findings.
Right. This constant question to the intel community generated some pretty interesting response from the Director of National Intelligence last week and his team. Others from the intel community, retired and advisors to Trump, have said, listen, they're all big boys and girls. How much has the Trump rhetoric on this actually impacted the intel community, do you think?
It's actually had an impact on their morale, and that's one.
How do you know that? You know that.
I know that.
You're connected in.
And one of the things that I think is really dangerous is, particularly the CIA is known for leaking information to damage those that attack it. So I don't think an incoming president is very wise to take on the intelligence community because they will leak him to death to undermine his policies. There's an old adage, presidents come and go, but bureaucrats reign forever. Well, this is the key constituency that has the information that can be used to either help the administration or hurt it. So he should be very careful when dealing with them.
That's pretty provocative. Now look, we're not living in a fairy tale land here, but you're telling me that CIA mentality is not so patriotic to just keep taking the blows from the president and suck it up?
Bureaucrats have to protect their standing. And when an institution is attacked, the individuals within that institution, again, not the leadership necessarily, but second and third tier individuals will leak. They have their own access to the press. And the ship of state is the only ship that leaks from the top down. So you have a lot of individuals within the upper echelons of the intelligence community or political community who have an incentive. So you can get leaks from members of Congress on the intelligence communities. You can get leaks from members of the intelligence community. All of these individuals have their own agendas. And if the president is seen as attacking them, they will fight back. That's politics. It's the same way. It's always been that way.
We don't know what Donald Trump has to be concerned about that way. Do you have any instinct as to?
Well, I think some of the reasons why
some of the business relationships in Russia and beyond still haven't gotten the kind of scrutiny and vetting that one would want.
That's right.
You're telling me that some of that probably is in the mix.
Well, I would think
I'm guessing. You're not telling me anything. I'm guessing it's in the mix.
I would think that the press and Democrats would have a strong incentive to look into those matters. But beyond that, it's also policy differences. See what the intelligence community just did now. In the last week, they gave President Obama an incredible array of information about influence that the Russians have had on the election. They gave that to President Obama
first.
Many days, several days before they gave it to Trump, even though they promised to give it to Trump several days earlier. So this made Trump look weak. That wasn't a coincidence. This was a pushback from the intelligence community. No one's above politics. And as much as we want the bureaucrats to be independent, they're not.
So who in the appointment array do you think has the wisdom and the temerity to explain this to Donald Trump?
Well, I think certainly General Mattis does. His nominee
He's
for
already, by the
SecDef.
way, having some challenges himself, wanting to appoint some people who were never Trumpers.
Right.
And there's just a philosophical no that's coming there. So already they're bumpy. It's what I understand. It's what I've been reading. Yes.
Yes. Also Pompeo, who's going to be his Director of Central Intelligence. Now, this is a member of Congress, so he has a lot of experience in the politics of it. He should be one of the ones talking to Trump. And frankly, Mike Flynn from Rhode Island, the former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and now his National Security Advisor nominee, should have enough background to try to smooth things out between the administration and the intelligence
Well, that
community.
Flynn-Mattis thing isn't working out that good right now, right? So, I mean, those guys aren't drinking beers together.
Well, Mattis has a gravitas that Flynn really respects. And because Mattis had that extra star that Flynn never received, in the military culture, you generally allow the guy with the extra star on his shoulders to dominate a little more than you do. And I suspect there'll be a nice balance between Mattis and Flynn on a lot of national security
Mattis will get the waiver. The waiver will be done.
Yes.
Yeah. So Flynn, by the way, doesn't need congressional approval.
No, as National Security Advisor, he doesn't have it.
Right. But this message to Donald Trump to kind of tighten up on the intel community has got to get through. I'm guessing when it's his intel community, it may be a different perspective, right?
One would hope.
Because everything that surrounds him is the greatest thing in the world. So once he's the president, not the elect, you would think that his disposition would change.
Yes, I would
Unless
think
they
so.
keep telling him, hey, boss, we got a Russian issue we haven't resolved here yet.
I think once Trump, one would hope that once Trump becomes comfortable in the position, that he will be a little more open to diverse opinions in the intelligence community. Now remember, there's going to be a push and a pull too. You have Mattis, who's extraordinarily anti-Russian, as well as Pompeo at CIA. They're very, they're not friends of Putin. Plus you have McCain and Rubio and Graham in the Senate pushing an anti-Russian strategy. So I think Trump's going to have to balance the two off. That said, look, having good relations with Russia is not in and of itself a bad thing. We have a lot of converging interests. So if we can cooperate where we converge in interests, that's good. It's where we diverge in interest that we have to be able to deter the Russians from acting the way we don't want them to.
Right, when we come back, I wonder whether Donald Trump has outsmarted all of us in this. Stay with us.
We can say, we have said repeatedly over the last 2 months that our source is not the Russian government and it is not a state party.
Yeah, whatever. We'll get back to that guy in a second. Is Donald Trump, with this pro-Putin type of disposition, tweeting thoughts out that we need to have a good relationship with Russia, all of that, is he sucking Vladimir Putin in with a team that really doesn't buy his act behind him, and then once he becomes inaugurated, this whole dynamic will change?
Getting inside of Donald Trump's head would be an amazing experience. It's hard to predict. One would hope...
I'm wanting to be bullish.
One would hope that this is an artful negotiator. And by negotiating, you either do it from a bullying perspective or you try to create a collaborative relationship to create an atmosphere of compromise. Now, according to that theory, he's doing exactly what he should do, making friends with Putin and working on areas that he considers much more important. And here's something, if you want to argue the Trump field, it is much more in the United States' interest to combat the Islamic State and terrorism than it is to worry about the Ukraine, which has traditionally been in the Russian sphere of influence anyway. So if he's willing to sacrifice the Ukraine for greater cooperation against the Islamic State, Trump may feel that's an okay balance.
What do you think?
I think it's a dangerous balance because Putin's aim is to try to recreate as much of the old Soviet Union as possible. He's an aggressive, assertive, cunning operator. To give him room, give him space in Eastern Europe, that just makes the rest of Eastern Europe a little more vulnerable.
Because I don't think it ought to be a negotiation to have a negative disposition, to hope that Russia, has a negative feel about radical Islamic terrorism. That's disruptive to everybody.
They have a large Muslim population.
So say, hey, well, listen, well, at least he agrees with us on ISIS. Well, no kidding, right? So giving away more territory and acquiescing in the Soviet sphere.
Well, remember, though, the Obama administration brought Putin into the negotiations over chemical weapons, and the hope was that Putin was going to persuade Assad to step down. Now, Putin checkmated the Obama administration by reinforcing Assad's power. So this isn't the first time that Putin has won the chess match with an American president.
All right. Going backwards to Mr. Assange, this is the guy that's in the middle of the WikiLeaks, says it's not the Russians, not the Russians. There's a good New York Times article out there that talks about his prediction a decade ago that he could create this kind of a mess. You don't trust this guy to throw him, do you?
Oh, gosh, no. In fact, the information that Assange got for WikiLeaks were from Russian hackers supported by the Russian intelligence community. So Assange is lying, and he knows that. The second aspect is, let's look at this individual. Julian Assange is an anarchist. He's trying to disrupt the international community. And the reason why he's aiming at the United States is because the United States as the superpower is the established power that keeps the status quo going. And the more he can weaken the United States, the more he can attack the fundamental aspects of the international system. He is an extraordinarily dangerous man.
What do you do with him?
I would try to shut him down. I would try to convince the Ecuadorians to force him out of the embassy, to bring him to justice for the rape case.
He's got a trial, right?
And to get rid of WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, even though a lot of people say, hey, look, you're bringing transparency to government, the problem is it's something that's not controlled. If you start putting the names and identities of people for the Defense Department and my Social Security number and all my personal information, then what good are you doing? You're just harming individuals.
Tomorrow, if everything went as scheduled, the president-elect has his first press conference. Do you have any expectations for it?
Predicting Donald Trump's behavior is something that I'm not willing to do. I hope that he's going to be much more level about the rhetoric that he uses, that he's going to take a couple steps back and say, yes, I understand that the Russians tried to influence. It didn't delegitimize my election, but I know that they played a role and they should be punished.
Like the script we're all begging for him to articulate.
Hope. Whether or not he does it, I don't know.
What else do you think he'll try to accomplish?
Well, I think the domestic agenda is his top. And this, repeal and replace Obamacare is going to be at the top of his agenda, as well as some, job creation programs. So if he sticks to his domestic policies, I think he has a chance of accomplishing something. If he then gets drawn more into foreign policy, then I think that might be more dangerous.
Stay tuned. Thanks.
Thank you.
Final word and we come back. So we'll see what happens in the Wednesday press conference. That's the tomorrow press conference, and whether or not this president-elect is predictable in any way, shape, or form, and whether he can delineate the issues when it comes to the Russian hack. We'll see you on the radio at 3 o'clock tomorrow on WPRO, and right back here tomorrow night. Thank you for watching. Good night.